Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt was born on January 17, 1853, in Mobile, Alabama, into a Southern family whose fortunes were disrupted by the Civil War. She is remembered as a central figure of the Gilded Age, known for orchestrating the marriage of her daughter Consuelo into the British aristocracy. But before she became associated with one of the most famous titled marriages in transatlantic history, before her name became permanently linked to Blenheim Palace, she was the daughter of a merchant family rebuilding after financial instability. Her life intersected with that of Marietta Leiter, born in 1858 in Chicago, whose daughter would marry into the British political elite. Together, these women became leading figures in a broader pattern in which American industrial wealth entered European aristocratic families through marriage settlements. Their actions connected railroads, retail empires, parliament, and hereditary estates during the late 19th century. Before we begin, please comment where in the world you are watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. Alva Erskine Smith was born on January 17, 1853, in Mobile, Alabama, into a family whose financial stability had been weakened by the Civil War. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, engaged in international trade, but the economic disruption of the conflict and its aftermath limited the family's security. During her childhood, the Smith family relocated to Europe for periods of time, including residence in France, before eventually re-establishing themselves in the United States. These early movements exposed Alva to European culture and social structures, an experience that later influenced her strategic outlook. By the early 1870s, the family's position had improved sufficiently to re-enter American society with renewed ambition. In 1875, Alva Smith married William Kissam Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose railroad empire had reshaped American transportation during the 19th century. The marriage placed her within one of the wealthiest families in the country. Cornelius Vanderbilt had consolidated rail lines, including the New York Central Railroad, generating immense capital accumulation. However, financial magnitude did not automatically guarantee social authority within New York's established elite. Families associated with older colonial lineage maintained informal control over access to prominent gatherings and patronage networks. The Vanderbilt name carried economic weight but required social consolidation. Throughout the late 1870s and early 1880s, Alva demonstrated deliberate engagement with this social structure. She supervised architectural commissions, interior decoration, and large-scale entertaining as instruments of status building. In 1883, she organized an elaborate masquerade ball at the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue. Invitations were selectively distributed, and attendance effectively signaled social acceptance. Contemporary newspaper accounts documented the scale of the event and its guest list. The occasion altered her standing within New York society. This was not incidental. It was a calculated demonstration of organizational authority, supported by financial resources. By the mid-1880s, Alva's position within elite circles had stabilized, yet her ambitions extended beyond domestic recognition. European aristocratic titles represented a form of inherited legitimacy unavailable within the American Republic. During this period, several British aristocratic families faced declining agricultural revenues and growing estate maintenance costs. American industrial capital offered liquidity that many titled households lacked. Alva recognized this imbalance. Her attention increasingly centered on her daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt, born in 1877, whose social presentation was carefully managed from an early age. Consuelo was educated within elite institutions and introduced at prominent gatherings under her mother's supervision. By the early 1890s, informal inquiries from European intermediaries began to circulate. British peers facing financial constraints considered alliances with wealthy American families. Alva engaged in structured correspondence and travel arrangements designed to evaluate prospects. The negotiations were financial as well as social. Legal counsel became involved to discuss dowry protections and inheritance provisions. These preparations reflected long-term planning rather than spontaneous opportunity. Within the Vanderbilt household, marital strategy functioned as an extension of family consolidation. William Kissam Vanderbilt's business obligations limited his direct involvement in social maneuvering, leaving Alva to manage the process. Estate records and correspondence confirm her active oversight. By the early 1890s, discussions with representatives connected to Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, intensified. Blenheim Palace required substantial financial reinforcement. The convergence of need and liquidity created a framework for agreement. The developments of this period reshaped Alva Vanderbilt's trajectory. From a merchant's daughter navigating post-war uncertainty, she had become an architect of transatlantic alliance. Her actions linked American railroad wealth to British hereditary estates. The decision created new complications within her family and established the foundation for one of the most discussed marriages of the late 19th century. The consequences would extend beyond social symbolism into documented financial transfer and estate preservation. By the early 1870s, New York City had become the financial center of the United States, driven by railroad expansion, banking consolidation, and industrial production. Fortunes accumulated rapidly in the hands of families such as the Vanderbilts, Cheene, Goulds, and Whitneys. Yet social authority within the city did not automatically correspond to economic power. Established families with colonial ancestry, including the Livingstons and Schuylers, maintained influence through long-standing networks that predated industrial wealth. Admission into their circles required more than capital. It required recognition. During this period, social leadership was informally associated with figures such as Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, whose guest lists defined elite legitimacy. Private balls, charity functions, and opera patronage operated as mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. Invitations were limited. Attendance signaled approval. Those outside these circles often found their wealth insufficient to secure entry. This structure shaped the environment that Alva Vanderbilt entered after her marriage in 1875. The Vanderbilt name carried economic authority, but lacked generational social lineage in New York. The imbalance created strategic pressure. Newly wealthy families sought validation through architecture, philanthropy, and conspicuous hosting. Mansions along Fifth Avenue were constructed not solely as residences, but as declarations of status. Architectural commissions by firms such as Richard Morris Hunt reflected deliberate alignment with European aesthetic traditions. Interior decoration incorporated imported materials and art collections intended to demonstrate cultivated taste. These decisions were documented in building contracts and society columns. They represented systematic efforts to translate financial power into social legitimacy. By 1883, when Alva Vanderbilt organized her widely reported masquerade ball, the structure of New York society had already solidified around exclusivity. Contemporary newspapers described the event's scale, guest attire, and expenditures. The publicity served a purpose. It forced acknowledgement from social arbiters who could not ignore the demonstration of influence. The event did not dismantle the hierarchy, but it altered Alva's position within it. Recognition followed visibility. At the same time, Maintenant, broader economic forces were reshaping both the United States and Britain. The Long Depression, beginning in 1873, affected agricultural profitability in Britain, reducing estate income tied to land rents. Aristocratic households faced maintenance costs that exceeded revenue. Meanwhile, American industrial capital remained comparatively liquid. Railroads expanded westward, department stores consolidated retail markets, and banking networks stabilized credit systems. The disparity between inherited titles and available cash became increasingly pronounced. Within this environment, transatlantic marriage emerged as a structured solution. American families possessed liquidity, but sought inherited prestige. British aristocrats possessed titles and estates, but required capital. Negotiations between these parties were not isolated incidents. They followed economic logic. Legal advisors drafted settlements that protected dowries while allocating funds toward estate stabilization. Newspaper coverage on both sides of the Atlantic reflected awareness of this exchange. The phrase later applied to these brides, "dollar princess," reflected public understanding of the arrangement. For Alva Vanderbilt and her contemporaries, The Gilded Age social order was not merely restrictive, it was instructive. It revealed the limits of domestic recognition and the potential of international alliance. By the late 1880s, discussions within elite American households increasingly included European prospects. The pattern developed gradually but systematically. Social ambition intersected with financial opportunity. These conditions formed the structural foundation for the marriage negotiations that would follow. The hierarchy in New York had encouraged outward-looking strategy. British estate decline had created receptivity. Together, these forces produced a transatlantic marriage market grounded in economic calculation and social ambition. In March of 1883, Alva Vanderbilt organized a masquerade ball at the Vanderbilt Mansion located at 5th Avenue and 52nd Street in New York City. The residence, designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt, had been completed only a short time earlier and was among the most elaborate private homes in the city. The decision to host the event followed years of tension between newly wealthy families and established social leaders. By that point, New York society operated through tightly controlled invitation lists. Attendance at major gatherings signaled recognition within the upper tier of elite circles. Exclusion carried equal meaning. Preparation for the ball required months of planning. Invitations were distributed selectively, and contemporary accounts indicate that several hundred guests were invited, including representatives of families previously reluctant to acknowledge the Vanderbilts socially. Costuming requirements were formal and often elaborate, reflecting European court traditions. Newspapers such as the New York Times reported extensively on the event before and after it occurred. Coverage detailed guest attire, interior decoration, and estimated expenditures. The publicity expanded the event beyond a private function into a widely observed social benchmark. The financial scale of the ball was considerable. Although precise figures vary among historical sources, expenditures were widely understood to reach levels unprecedented for a private American social event at that time. The ballroom was constructed specifically for large-scale entertaining, and additional floral arrangements, imported fabrics, and orchestral performances were secured for the evening. The Vanderbilt residence itself functioned as an assertion of permanence along Fifth Avenue, an area rapidly transforming into a corridor of elite domestic architecture. The ball reinforced that architectural statement with social visibility. The consequences were immediate. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, who had previously maintained control over New York's most exclusive guest lists, attended the event. Her presence carried symbolic weight. Social columns interpreted it as formal acknowledgement of the Vanderbilt family's standing. This shift did not eliminate hierarchy, but it altered the balance within it. Alva Vanderbilt had demonstrated that wealth, when strategically deployed, could influence recognition. The event reshaped her authority within elite circles and confirmed her capacity to mobilize resources for calculated social outcomes. Beyond personal validation, the ball also reflected broader structural change within American society during the late 19th century. Industrial fortunes were consolidating at a pace that outstripped older mercantile wealth. Railroad networks, including those controlled by the Vanderbilt family, connected regional markets and generated consistent revenue streams. Financial capital accumulated in concentrated form. Social institutions were adjusting, sometimes reluctantly, to this economic reality. Public events such as the 1883 ball illustrated the intersection of private wealth and public acknowledgement. For Alva Vanderbilt, the ball represented more than celebration. It functioned as proof that organized effort could overcome resistance. By the mid-1880s, her position within New York society was no longer tentative. Invitations were reciprocal. Her household operated as a recognized center of elite activity. This consolidation at home clarified her next objective. If recognition could be secured domestically through demonstration, it could also be extended internationally through alliance. The 1883 ball thus marked a transitional point. It resolved one phase of social contest within New York and laid groundwork for broader ambition. The strategy of calculated display had proven effective. The next stage would move beyond Fifth Avenue toward European aristocratic estates, where titles rather than invitations defined permanence. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2, 1877, in New York City, the only daughter of Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt and William Kissam Vanderbilt. Her birth occurred at a time when the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune was expanding through consolidation of the New York Central system and related lines. From infancy, Consuelo occupied a position shaped by both wealth and expectation. Household correspondence and later memoir accounts confirmed that her upbringing was structured with deliberate attention to social presentation. Tutors were engaged, language instruction emphasized, and travel to Europe incorporated into her education. These decisions were not incidental. They reflected long-term planning within the Vanderbilt household. During the 1880s, Alva Vanderbilt increasingly treated her daughter's future marriage as a strategic matter. Consuelo was introduced into New York society through carefully managed appearances at receptions and cultural events. Her clothing, companions, and schedule were supervised. By the early 1890s, as she approached adulthood, discussions about potential European alliances intensified. British aristocratic families facing financial strain were actively considering marriages with wealthy American heirs. The agricultural depression affecting British landowners had reduced rental income from estates. Maintenance of large properties such as Blenheim Palace required capital beyond what land revenue could reliably produce. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, inherited his title in 1883, along with significant estate obligations. Blenheim Palace, constructed in the early 18th century, required extensive maintenance, staffing, and structural upkeep. Estate accounts revealed ongoing financial pressure. Intermediaries facilitated introductions between the Marlborough and Vanderbilt families during the early 1890s. Meetings occurred in both London and New York. Negotiations followed a structured pattern common to aristocratic alliances of the period. Legal representatives discussed dowry size, trust arrangements, and inheritance protections. The proposed dowry for Consuelo exceeded $2 million, an amount substantial even by Gilded Age standards. Contracts outlined allocation of funds toward estate stabilization, while preserving certain financial protections for Consuelo personally. Documentation confirms that the settlement was negotiated carefully, with attention to property law in both the United States and Britain. Public announcement of the engagement occurred in 1894, generating widespread press coverage. Newspapers in New York and London detailed the scale of the dowry and the historical importance of the Marlborough title. The marriage ceremony took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church in New York City. The union immediately transferred American capital into one of Britain's most prominent ducal estates. Blenheim Palace benefited from debt reduction and modernization projects funded through the dowry. Renovations addressed structural repairs and operational costs. The marriage also elevated the Vanderbilt name within international society. Consuelo became Duchess of Marlborough and relocated to England, assuming formal responsibilities tied to the title. Public duties included hosting events, overseeing charitable engagements, and managing estate representation. However, personal compatibility between Consuelo and the Duke proved limited. Contemporary correspondence indicates tension early in the marriage. Separation occurred in the early 20th century, followed by formal annulment in 1921. Despite the dissolution, the financial objectives underlying the alliance had already been realized. Estate stability had improved. The title had gained American capital. The Vanderbilt family had secured association with a prominent British lineage. The marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt marked a defining example of transatlantic strategy during the late 19th century. It demonstrated how economic imbalance between industrial America and land-based Britain created mutually reinforcing incentives. For Alva Vanderbilt, the outcome validated years of calculated preparation. For the Marlborough estate, it provided measurable financial relief. The arrangement would become one of the most frequently cited cases in discussions of American heiresses marrying into European nobility. The financial settlement arranged prior to the marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt and Charles Spencer Churchill in November 1895 was formalized through detailed legal agreements negotiated in both New York and London. Attorneys representing the Vanderbilt family structured the dowry to exceed $2 million, with provisions designed to protect portions of the principal through trust arrangements. British legal advisors ensured that allocated funds could be directed toward the stabilization of the Marlborough estates. This was not an informal understanding. It was documented in binding contracts reviewed under both American and British law. At the time of the marriage, Blenheim Palace faced sustained financial strain. Agricultural rents, which had traditionally supported aristocratic households, had declined during the late 19th century due to global competition and falling grain prices. Maintenance costs for the palace, its grounds, and associated properties remained high. Estate ledgers from the period reflect ongoing obligations tied to staff wages, repairs, and debt servicing. The infusion of American capital allowed for immediate debt reduction and deferred maintenance projects to proceed. Structural repairs were undertaken, and modernization efforts improved operational efficiency within the estate. Public reporting on the marriage and just emphasized the magnitude of the transfer. Newspapers in both countries detailed the dowry and described the alliance as a convergence of American wealth and British title. The visibility reinforced awareness of a broader pattern already emerging among elite families. The Marlborough marriage became a reference point for similar negotiations involving other American heiresses. It demonstrated that large-scale transfers could be executed with legal precision and social acceptance. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, relocation to England required adjustment to formal aristocratic protocols. As Duchess of Marlborough, she assumed responsibilities that included managing aspects of household representation and participating in charitable initiatives. Estate correspondence indicates her involvement in social hosting and philanthropic events tied to the local community. However, the marital relationship itself encountered difficulty. Contemporary accounts and later statements by Consuelo describe limited compatibility between the spouses. By the early 1900s, separation had occurred in practice, though the formal bond remained intact for several years. The marriage was annulled in 1921, following mutual agreement and ecclesiastical proceedings recognized by the Catholic Church. The annulment addressed personal circumstances but did not reverse the financial impact of the original settlement. Funds transferred to the estate had already been absorbed into debt reduction and capital improvements. Blenheim Palace continued to operate under improved financial conditions relative to the period preceding the marriage. The transaction had achieved its primary economic objective. For Alva Vanderbilt, the outcome confirmed the effectiveness of structured negotiation. Despite the later dissolution, the Vanderbilt name had been linked permanently with one of Britain's most historically significant ducal houses. The settlement illustrated how private family decisions intersected with broader economic forces during the late 19th century. Industrial capital from the United States had entered the core of British hereditary property. The Marlborough case did not stand alone. Its documentation in legal records, estate accounts, and press coverage provided a model for subsequent alliances. The consequences extended beyond individual biography. They altered financial trajectories of aristocratic estates and demonstrated that American liquidity could reinforce traditional. This development prepared the ground for parallel arrangements involving other American families, including the Leiters of Chicago, whose negotiations would soon follow a comparable path. Marietta Leiter was born in 1858 into a family connected to the expanding commercial networks of the American Midwest. In 1875, she married Levi Ziegler Leiter, co-founder of the dry goods firm Field and Leiter in Chicago. The company, which later evolved into Marshall Field and Company after organizational restructuring, became one of the most prominent retail enterprises in the United States. Its growth coincided with Chicago's rapid post-Civil War expansion as a transportation and distribution hub. Rail connections linking the city to eastern manufacturers and western agricultural producers created sustained commercial opportunity. The later fortune developed within this context of large-scale retail consolidation. By the 1880s, Levi Leiter had diversified investments beyond retail into real estate and utilities. Financial records indicate substantial property holdings in Chicago and Washington. This accumulation provided liquidity comparable to older East Coast fortunes. However, as in New York, economic power did not automatically translate into international prestige. Marietta Leiter demonstrated awareness of this distinction. She prioritized education, travel, and social positioning for her children, particularly her daughter Mary Victoria Leiter, born in 1870. During the late 1880s, the Leiter family began extended stays in London. These visits were not incidental tourism. They served as introductions into British elite society. Through social intermediaries, Marietta cultivated relationships with aristocratic households experiencing financial constraint. British landed income had declined over previous decades, and estate maintenance costs continued to rise. American wealth offered financial reinforcement without requiring sale of ancestral property. The structural alignment resembled earlier patterns observed among New York families. Mary Victoria Leiter entered London society during her early 20s. Contemporary accounts describe her presence at formal gatherings where she met George Nathaniel Curzon, heir to Kettleston Hall in Derbyshire. Curzon, born in 1859, was educated at Eton and Oxford and had established himself within conservative political circles. Although his family possessed title and estate, financial flexibility remained limited. Political advancement required resources for travel, representation, and constituency engagement. Marriage to a wealthy American offered both personal alliance and economic reinforcement. Negotiations between the Leiter and Curzon families progressed steadily. As with the Vanderbilt marriage, legal counsel structured the financial arrangements. Mary's dowry provided significant capital infusion. The marriage ceremony took place in April 1895 in Washington, D.C., reflecting the family's American base. Press coverage in both countries emphasized the union of Chicago commercial wealth with British aristocratic lineage. The agreement reflected practical calculation rather than novelty. Following the marriage, Mary relocated to England and assumed responsibilities consistent with aristocratic expectations. Financial stability enhanced Curzon's political trajectory. In 1899, he was appointed Viceroy of India, one of the most prominent administrative roles within the British Empire. The position required substantial ceremonial expenditure and public hosting. The resources associated with Mary's dowry supported these obligations. Estate accounts from Kettleston Hall record improvements during this period, indicating measurable financial impact. Mary Victoria Curzon's tenure as vicereine included philanthropic and cultural engagements documented in official correspondence. Her health declined during the early 1900s, and she died in 1906. Despite her early death, the marriage had reinforced Curzon's political and financial standing. The integration of American capital into British governance structures was evident. Marietta Leiter's strategy paralleled that of Alva Vanderbilt in method and outcome. Both recognized the reciprocal needs of American liquidity and British hereditary status. Through structured negotiation, they aligned family wealth with titled households facing economic constraint. The Leiter alliance demonstrated that the phenomenon extended beyond New York into emerging centers of American capital, such as Chicago. Mary Victoria Leiter was born on May 27, 1870, in Chicago, Illinois, during a period of rapid urban and commercial expansion in the American Midwest. Her father, Levi Ziegler Leiter, accumulated substantial wealth through retail enterprise and real estate investment. By the late 1880s, the Leiter family had established residences in both Chicago and Washington, D.C., positioning themselves within political as well as commercial networks. Mary received private tutoring and was introduced into elite social circles during extended visits to London arranged by her mother, Marietta Leiter. These visits facilitated her introduction to British aristocratic society. In 1895, Mary married George Nathaniel Curzon, heir to Kettleston Hall in Derbyshire, and a rising conservative politician. The ceremony took place in Washington, reflecting the American origins of the dowry that accompanied the marriage. Financial arrangements were formalized through legal contracts, allocating substantial funds toward estate stabilization and personal settlement. Curzon's political ambitions required consistent expenditure for travel, representation, and constituency obligations. The dowry enhanced his capacity to pursue these objectives without liquidating family property. By 1899, Curzon's career advanced significantly when he was appointed Viceroy of India. The appointment placed him at the administrative head of British India, responsible for overseeing governance across a vast territory. Mary, as Viceroy, assumed ceremonial and social responsibilities integral to imperial administration. Official records document her participation in public receptions, charitable initiatives, and cultural engagements during the viceregal tenure. The position required maintenance of elaborate official residences and formal entertaining. Financial support derived from the marriage settlement contributed to meeting these demands. The viceregal years placed Mary within the framework of imperial governance rather than solely aristocratic society. Her correspondence reflects attention to health conditions in India, including hospital support and engagement with local institutions. While ceremonial duties defined much of her public role, administrative protocol required consistent representation. These obligations demanded financial stability, which the later dowry had helped secure. Estate records at Kettleston Hall show ongoing improvements during this period, reinforcing the tangible impact of American capital. Mary's health deteriorated during the early 1900s. After returning to England, she died in 1906 at the age of 36. Her death curtailed direct influence within imperial circles, yet the structural effects of the marriage remained. Curzon continued his political career, later serving as Foreign Secretary in the 1920s. The financial reinforcement provided at the outset of the marriage had contributed to sustaining his trajectory within national government. The Curzon-Leiter alliance illustrated the integration of American wealth into both aristocratic and administrative spheres of Britain. Unlike purely ceremonial marriages, this union intersected directly with imperial governance. It demonstrated that dowries could influence not only estate maintenance, but also public office. The arrangement aligned Chicago retail capital with British state authority at a high level. By the early 20th century, the pattern established by families such as the Vanderbilts and Leiters had become widely recognized. American heiresses continued to marry into titled households facing financial pressure. These alliances were structured through documented legal agreements and supported by economic calculation. The Mary-Leiter marriage confirmed that the exchange extended beyond social prestige into political infrastructure. The convergence of liquidity and lineage reshaped both private estates and public institutions during the late 19th century and early 20th century. By the late 19th century, transatlantic marriages between American heiresses and British aristocrats were governed by formal legal frameworks rather than informal social understandings. The scale of wealth involved required detailed contractual agreements drafted by attorneys in both jurisdictions. These settlements addressed dowry allocation, property rights, inheritance provisions, and protections for the bride. Surviving documents from the Vanderbilt and Leiter marriages illustrate the precision with which these arrangements were executed. Funds were not transferred without stipulation. They were structured within trusts and subject to clearly defined conditions. In the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage in 1895, their legal advisors representing the Vanderbilt family insisted upon financial safeguards. Portions of the dowry were placed in trust to ensure personal income independent of estate management. At the same time, substantial sums were allocated directly toward the obligations of Blenheim Palace. Estate debt reduction and capital improvements were prioritized. British counsel ensured that transfers complied with domestic inheritance law and estate settlement practices. The process required coordination across national legal systems. Mary Victoria Leiter's marriage to George Curzon followed a similar structure. Dowry provisions were negotiated in advance of the ceremony, specifying how funds would support Kettleston Hall and related responsibilities. Trust mechanisms preserved elements of the principle for long-term security. These agreements reflected awareness of financial risk. Aristocratic estates, though prestigious, were not immune to mismanagement or fluctuating agricultural income. American families sought assurances that their daughters would retain independent resources. The public was not entirely excluded from these financial details. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, and London frequently reported estimated dowry amounts. While precise figures were sometimes speculative, the existence of large transfers was widely acknowledged. Press coverage reinforced understanding that these marriages represented economic alliances. The phrase later applied to American brides, often termed dollar princesses, reflected recognition of the monetary dimension underlying the unions. This was not speculation. It was documented in contracts and estate accounts. Legal complexity increased when marriages encountered difficulty. In the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt's annulment in 1921, ecclesiastical and civil considerations intersected. Financial settlements were not reversed, as funds allocated to estate stabilization had already been integrated into property management. Trust arrangements protected certain income streams. The durability of these agreements demonstrates that the economic framework often outlasted the personal relationship. These contractual structures reveal that transatlantic marriages functioned within a disciplined financial system. They were not impulsive social events. They were transactions shaped by attorneys, estate managers, and financial advisors. Each clause reflected negotiation, informed by economic necessity and social ambition. The American families provided liquidity. The British families provided title and inherited property. Law ensured that both sides understood the exchange. By the early 20th century, this pattern had become standardized. Engagement announcements often followed preliminary legal review. Financial settlements were calculated in relation to estate debt levels and maintenance costs. Archival records preserved in British country houses and American family papers confirmed the systematic character of these alliances. The structure reinforced a broader conclusion. These marriages were part of an organized transatlantic market in which capital and hereditary status were exchanged through documented, enforceable agreements. As transatlantic marriages increased in frequency during the late 19th century, public commentary expanded alongside them. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, and London treated these alliances as matters of international interest. Engagement announcements were often accompanied by detailed estimates of dowry amounts and background summaries of titled families. The marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1895 received sustained coverage in major publications, including descriptions of the ceremony, the financial settlement, and the historical lineage of the Marlborough title. Similar reporting followed the marriage of Mary Victoria Leiter earlier that same year. The press did not treat these unions as private events. They were presented as indicators of shifting economic relationships. In the United States, reactions were divided. Some commentators interpreted the marriages as evidence that American industrial wealth had achieved global recognition. Editorial writers pointed to the fact that British dukes and earls were willing to negotiate with families whose fortunes derived from railroads and retail rather than inherited land. Others expressed concern that the exchange contradicted Republican ideals. The United States had been founded without a hereditary aristocracy, and the voluntary pursuit of titles raised questions about national identity. Political leaders did not intervene legally, but commentary reflected unease in certain circles. In Britain, responses were similarly mixed. Aristocratic households facing financial strain often welcomed American alliances. Estate correspondence from the period reveals practical considerations dominating private discussion. Debt reduction and capital improvements were tangible benefits. However, segments of British society questioned the cultural implications of admitting foreign wealth into long-standing hereditary lines. Satirical cartoons in London publications occasionally portrayed American brides as embodiments of commercial influence entering traditional estates. Despite these depictions, the legal and social framework permitted the marriages without institutional resistance. Public fascination intensified during the 1900s as additional American heiresses married into European titles. The cumulative effect created a recognizable pattern. The term dollar princess gained circulation as shorthand for wealthy American women entering aristocratic families. The label reflected economic awareness rather than personal critique. By this time, more than several dozen such unions had occurred. Each reinforced the perception that a structured exchange was underway between liquidity and lineage. The debate did not significantly alter behavior. Families on both sides of the Atlantic continued to negotiate. Economic incentives remained strong. British agricultural income had not fully recovered, and maintenance costs for large estates persisted. American industrial fortunes, particularly those generated during the railroad and manufacturing expansions, remained substantial. Social ambition within elite American households complemented financial need within aristocratic Britain. The public discourse therefore functioned more as commentary than constraint. Legal contracts continued to be drafted. Engagements were announced. Ceremonies were conducted with formal recognition in both countries. The cumulative visibility of these marriages transformed them from isolated events into a defined historical phenomenon. By the early 20th century, transatlantic alliances had become embedded in public consciousness. They illustrated the intersection of wealth, status, and national identity during a period of economic globalization. The debate surrounding them revealed tensions within both societies, yet it did not halt the practice. Instead, it documented a transition in which financial capital increasingly influenced hereditary structures across national boundaries. By the closing years of the 19th century, the financial effects of American dowries on British estates had become measurable in property accounts and renovation records. Many aristocratic households that entered these marriages did so amid declining agricultural income and accumulated maintenance obligations. Estate ledgers from properties such as Blenheim Palace and Kettleston Hall reveal persistent repair costs related to roofing, masonry, heating systems, and staff quarters. Without external capital, portions of these properties risked deterioration or partial liquidation. The arrival of American funds altered that trajectory. At Blenheim Palace, the Dasinski and Baumpaus, the dowry accompanying Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage in 1895 enabled structured debt reduction and modernization projects. Documentation from estate management records indicates allocation of funds toward structural repairs, interior refurbishment, and improved infrastructure. Maintenance of a property of that scale required steady capital flow. Agricultural rents alone were insufficient during this period. The financial transfer from the Vanderbilt settlement provided liquidity that could be directed immediately toward overdue work. This was not symbolic preservation, it was practical stabilization. Kettleston Hall experienced comparable reinforcement following the marriage of Mary Victoria Leiter in 1895. Although smaller in scale than Blenheim, Kettleston required ongoing investment to sustain operations consistent with aristocratic standards. Estate correspondence from the late 19th century references improvements financed after the Curzon marriage. Funds supported modernization and the maintenance of extensive grounds. These expenditures preserved architectural continuity that might otherwise have faced compromise under financial strain. The preservation effect extended beyond individual estates. Across Britain, similar marriages introduced American capital into properties that had been constructed during the 17th and 18th centuries. The cost of maintaining these structures had increased as industrial materials and labor pricing shifted during the 19th century. Aristocratic families frequently lacked liquid assets despite holding substantial land. Dowries from American families provided immediate cash infusion without requiring sale of heritage property. The arrangement aligned financial necessity with social continuity. Architectural historians examining estate archives have traced renovation timelines to coincide with marriage settlements. In several documented cases, capital improvements followed within months of dowry transfer. Roof repairs, electrical installation, plumbing modernization, and interior restoration appear in sequential accounting entries. The documentation demonstrates cause and effect. Funds were received. Work commenced. Obligations were addressed. These interventions had long-term consequences. Properties stabilized during the late 19th century were better positioned to withstand the additional pressures that would arise during the First World War and the interwar taxation policies that followed. While many estates still faced difficulty in the 20th century, those reinforced earlier had avoided immediate structural decline. The marriages therefore contributed to architectural survival beyond their immediate financial context. The estate preservation dimension also shaped public perception. Visitors and commentators associated American heiresses with visible improvements to historic properties. This association reinforced the narrative that industrial wealth was sustaining hereditary architecture. Though critics sometimes framed the exchange as transactional, the physical outcome was concrete. Buildings remained intact, staff employment continued, collections were retained. By the early 20th century, the architectural consequences of these alliances had become embedded within the landscape of British country houses. The preservation was not accidental. It followed negotiated financial agreements executed with legal precision. American liquidity had entered estate accounts at critical moments. The result was measurable continuity within structures that might otherwise have faced fragmentation or sale. By the turn of the 20th century, the integration of American wealth into British aristocratic families had implications beyond estate maintenance. Several marriages intersected directly with political office and institutional authority. The most prominent example remained the marriage of Mary Victoria Leiter to George Nathaniel Curzon in 1895. Curzon had already established himself within the Conservative Party, serving as Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs during the early 1890s. However, advancement within national government required sustained financial capacity. Parliamentary life imposed obligations for travel, hosting, and constituency engagement that extended beyond personal income derived from land. The Leiter dowry provided financial reinforcement that stabilized Curzon's position. When he was appointed Viceroy of India in 1899, the role demanded extensive ceremonial expenditure and administrative representation. Official residences in Calcutta and Simla required maintenance at imperial scale, entertaining dignitaries, supporting charitable initiatives, and overseeing public functions formed part of the office. While the British government funded aspects of administration, private wealth supplemented social obligations tied to status. The financial structure created by the marriage eased these pressures. The influence was not confined to Curzon alone. Other American heiresses who married into titled families indirectly supported parliamentary careers. Estate records from various households indicate that dowries were used to consolidate debts, allowing peers to maintain political engagement without liquidating property. Aristocratic titles alone did not guarantee liquidity. In a period when electoral politics and party organization required consistent resources, capital from American families contributed to institutional continuity. This intersection of private settlement and public office reflected broader patterns within the British constitutional framework. Members of the House of Lords often managed large estates while participating in legislative debate. Financial stability influenced their capacity to remain active. The infusion of American funds therefore affected not only household accounts, but also the sustainability of aristocratic participation in governance. The effect was structural rather than ideological. Public awareness of this dimension remained limited compared to fascination with titles and ceremonies. Newspapers focused primarily on dowry amounts and wedding spectacle. However, archival correspondence between estate managers and political associates reveals acknowledgement of financial reinforcement. Improvements in estate solvency reduced vulnerability during election cycles and policy disputes. The economic underpinning strengthened political continuity. In the United States, observers noted that American capital was supporting members of a hereditary legislature abroad. While criticism occasionally surfaced, no legal barriers prevented such transfers. The phenomenon unfolded within the framework of private contract. Families exercised discretion over their wealth. Governments did not intervene. By the early 1900s, the cumulative effect of these marriages had subtly altered the composition of certain aristocratic households. American-born duchesses and countesses were present within estates whose heads participated in national governance. The linkage between industrial capital and hereditary authority was no longer isolated. It had become normalized within segments of British political life. These developments demonstrate that the consequences of transatlantic marriages extended beyond architecture and social prestige. They reinforced institutional participation by stabilizing the financial base of titled families. The exchange between American liquidity and British lineage therefore carried implications for governance as well as property. By the early 20th century, several of the most prominent transatlantic marriages began to encounter personal strain. The marriage between Consuelo Vanderbilt and Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, had been formalized in November 1895 after extensive financial negotiation. While the dowry achieved its intended purpose of stabilizing Blenheim Palace, compatibility between the spouses proved limited. Contemporary correspondence and later memoir accounts confirm that the union functioned primarily as a strategic alliance rather than a personal partnership. The imbalance between financial objective and domestic harmony became increasingly visible during the first decade of the 20th century. Consuelo fulfilled her formal responsibilities as Duchess of Marlborough, participating in charitable initiatives and estate representation. However, separation occurred in practice during the early 1900s. The couple lived largely independent lives while maintaining the appearance of marital continuity. British aristocratic custom often discouraged public dissolution, particularly when estates depended upon alliance stability. Nevertheless, legal and ecclesiastical avenues for annulment existed under specific circumstances. In 1921, the marriage was formally annulled through proceedings recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. The annulment cited the absence of full consent at the time of the wedding. Documentation from the period indicates that both parties agreed to the dissolution. Importantly, the financial settlement negotiated in 1895 remained intact. Funds transferred to Blenheim Palace had already been integrated into estate accounts. Trust structures preserved income streams allocated to Consuelo. The legal separation did not reverse the economic transaction that had occurred decades earlier. Other transatlantic marriages experienced similar strain, though not all concluded formally. Cultural adjustment, differing expectations, and geographic displacement contributed to tension. American brides often relocated permanently to estates governed by long-standing tradition and rigid social protocol. The transition required adaptation to household hierarchies and public obligations unfamiliar within American society. While some women successfully integrated, others reported isolation or incompatibility. Mary Victoria Leiter's marriage to George Curzon did not face annulment, but it was shaped by the demands of imperial office. Her tenure as Viceroy of India required sustained public engagement. Health complications limited her long-term participation, and her death in 1906 concluded the marriage prematurely. In that case, Mulworth's personal strain was overshadowed by physical decline rather than legal dispute. The financial structure established at marriage, however, continued to influence estate stability and Curzon's political career. The broader pattern demonstrates that these alliances were durable financially, even when fragile domestically. Legal contracts prioritized property settlement and inheritance planning. Emotional compatibility was secondary within negotiation frameworks. Estate preservation and title continuity remained central objectives. When marriages dissolved, financial arrangements often persisted. By the 1920s, public awareness of annulments and separations contributed to shifting perception of transatlantic unions. The early phase of enthusiastic celebration gave way to more measured assessment. Economic benefits were undeniable, yet personal cost became increasingly visible. Nonetheless, the contractual architecture that defined these marriages had already secured long-term consequences. Estates remained solvent. Titles retained association with American wealth. The experience of divorce and annulment did not dismantle the structural exchange between capital and lineage. It revealed the limits of strategic alliance at the personal level while confirming the durability of its financial framework. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 marked a structural turning point in the pattern of transatlantic marriages between American heiresses and British aristocrats. International travel became restricted, financial markets destabilized, and priorities within both societies shifted toward wartime mobilization. Aristocratic estates faced new taxation policies designed to fund military expenditure. Land values fluctuated, and many country houses were requisitioned for hospital or military use. The environment that had previously encouraged strategic marriage alliances began to contract. British taxation policy during and after the war imposed heavier estate duties and income assessments on landed families. The financial pressures that had motivated aristocrats to seek American dowries did not disappear, but the context changed. Liquid American fortunes were increasingly affected by domestic tax reforms in the United States. The introduction of federal income tax in 1913 and subsequent rate increases during wartime reduced disposable capital among industrial families. The scale of dowries common in the 1890s became more difficult to sustain in the 1920s. At the same time, social attitudes evolved. The 19th century had treated aristocratic titles as stable markers of inherited authority. By the early 20th century, democratic reforms and expanding suffrage in Britain began to alter perceptions of hereditary privilege. The Parliament Act of 1911 reduced the legislative power of the House of Lords. Political authority shifted incrementally toward elected institutions. The symbolic value of marrying into a hereditary title diminished relative to earlier decades. In the United States, the cultural climate also shifted. Progressive-era reforms emphasized regulation, public accountability, and skepticism toward concentrated wealth. Industrial magnates faced scrutiny over labor conditions and monopolistic practices. Public enthusiasm for European aristocratic affiliation softened. Although marriages continued to occur, the frequency declined compared to the concentrated wave of alliances during the late 19th century. The transatlantic marriage market no longer operated with the same intensity. Economic disruption during the 1920s and the Great Depression further constrained large-scale dowry transfers. American fortunes contracted significantly after 1929. British estates, already under tax pressure, encountered additional financial instability. Many aristocratic families were forced to sell art collections or portions of land regardless of earlier American alliances. The structural imbalance that had facilitated marriage exchange was no longer characterized by abundant American liquidity and predictable British need. Both sides faced economic uncertainty. By the mid-20th century, the era commonly associated with dollar princess marriages had largely concluded. While individual cases persisted, they did not reflect the systematic pattern observed between the 1870s and the outbreak of the First World War. Estate records from this later period show greater reliance on public tourism, property subdivision, and heritage trusts rather than dowry infusion. The mechanism of preservation shifted from private marriage settlement to institutional adaptation. The decline after 1914 therefore reflected multiple converging forces. War disrupted mobility and capital flow. Tax policy reduced disposable wealth. Political reform altered the prestige attached to hereditary titles. Economic contraction limited large settlements. The environment that had enabled mothers such as Alva Vanderbilt and Marietta Leiter to negotiate transatlantic alliances no longer existed in comparable form. The structural exchange between American capital and British lineage had defined a distinct period in late 19th century history. After the First World War, that period entered closure. The consequences of earlier marriages endured within estates and family lines, but the pattern itself receded into historical record rather than continuing as active practice. During the late 19th century, the orchestration of transatlantic marriages frequently depended upon the strategic involvement of mothers who controlled access, presentation, and financial negotiation. Alva Vanderbilt and Marietta Leiter were not passive observers of their daughters' futures. They functioned as primary architects of alliance formation. Household correspondence, travel records, and social calendars demonstrate their direct oversight of introductions, invitations, and extended stays abroad. Their influence derived from both financial authority and social ambition. In elite American households of this period, daughters were introduced into society through carefully timed debut seasons. Appearances at formal balls, charity functions, and opera performances were managed to maximize exposure within controlled circles. Mothers supervised attire, escort arrangements, and social conversation. These actions were structured rather than informal. The objective was not merely social enjoyment, but strategic positioning. When European prospects emerged, travel to London or Paris followed. Extended residencies facilitated contact with aristocratic families navigating financial pressure. Alva Vanderbilt's management of Consuelo's social calendar during the early 1890s illustrates this approach. Invitations were accepted selectively. Meetings with British intermediaries were arranged during visits abroad. Correspondence preserved in family archives reveals attention to rank, estate condition, and political connection. The process resembled negotiation, rather than courtship in the conventional sense. Financial capacity was assessed alongside hereditary standing. The eventual agreement with the Duke of Marlborough followed sustained evaluation. Marietta Leiter employed comparable methods. During London seasons in the late 1880s and early 1890s, she cultivated access to titled households while maintaining control over her daughter's engagements. Social introductions were facilitated through diplomatic and commercial networks connected to Chicago and Washington. When Mary Victoria Leiter encountered George Curzon, the relationship unfolded within this structured environment. The dowry discussions that followed were managed by legal counsel, but maternal oversight shaped the preliminary alignment. The authority exercised by these mothers reflected broader norms within elite society. Marriage among affluent families was frequently treated as a family alliance, rather than solely a personal decision. Control over dowry funds granted leverage in negotiation. Financial settlement could determine the scale of ceremony, the location of residence, and the distribution of estate obligations. Mothers who directed these processes influenced outcomes directly. Their role extended beyond social hosting into contractual decision-making. Criticism occasionally surfaced in public commentary, suggesting that daughters were instruments within economic exchange. However, archival documentation indicates that such marriages were negotiated openly among families aware of the reciprocal benefits. Estate preservation and status consolidation were acknowledged objectives. The maternal role was therefore embedded within accepted social practice of the period. By the early 20th century, as transatlantic marriages declined, the influence of maternal strategy receded correspondingly. The conditions that had made such alliances advantageous shifted under wartime disruption and tax reform. Yet during the peak decades of the 1880s and 1890s, mothers such as Alva Vanderbilt and Marietta Leiter operated as central figures within a structured transnational market. Their management linked American industrial fortunes with British hereditary estates through deliberate planning. The decisions they supervised produced consequences visible in property accounts, political careers, and genealogical records. Maternal strategy functioned as an essential mechanism within the broader exchange between capital and title. Following their marriages into British aristocratic families, American heiresses entered environments governed by long-established customs, estate hierarchies, and public expectations. The transition from American urban wealth to rural British landed life required sustained adjustment. Household management in aristocratic estates involved oversight of domestic staff structured by rank and tradition. Duties extended beyond private residence into community engagement, charitable patronage, and representation at regional events. American brides were expected to conform to these established patterns without disrupting institutional continuity. Consuelo Vanderbilt's relocation to Blenheim Palace in the late 1890s illustrates the scale of this transition. The estate operated with extensive staff, formalized routines, and obligations tied to local tenantry. Public appearances reinforced the Duke's status within national society. As Duchess of Marlborough, Consuelo was required to host gatherings, supervise aspects of domestic administration, and participate in philanthropic initiatives. These responsibilities were distinct from the social entertainment culture of Fifth Avenue. Estate life demanded adherence to protocol and deference to inherited practice. Mary Victoria Leiter's experience at Kettleston Hall and later within vice-regal residences in India further demonstrates the complexity of integration. As vicereine beginning in 1899, she participated in ceremonial functions governed by imperial code. Public receptions, official visits, and charitable oversight required familiarity with diplomatic protocol. The position involved both symbolic and administrative dimensions. Financial reinforcement from her dowry supported these obligations, yet personal adaptation remained essential. Cultural differences sometimes produced strain. American social norms emphasized relative informality compared to British aristocratic convention. Adjustment required restraint in public speech, dress conformity, and observance of hierarchical etiquette. Letters preserved in private archives reference periods of isolation experienced by certain American brides who had relocated far from their original support networks. Nevertheless, some women adapted successfully, establishing philanthropic reputations within their adopted communities. The integration of American heiresses also influenced aristocratic households incrementally. Exposure to American philanthropy models and social organization introduced subtle changes in charitable engagement. While British estates retained traditional structure, the presence of American-born duchesses and countesses diversified household perspectives. These developments were gradual rather than transformative. Institutional continuity remained primary. By the early 20th century, American brides had become a recognizable component of certain British aristocratic circles. Their financial contributions stabilized estates, while their social participation reinforced public visibility. However, integration did not eliminate underlying tension between economic exchange and personal adaptation. The contractual framework that initiated these marriages could not fully regulate cultural transition. The experiences of Consuelo Vanderbilt and Mary Victoria Leiter demonstrate that transatlantic alliances required more than financial negotiation. They demanded sustained adjustment to inherited systems of authority and representation. While estates benefited materially, individual adaptation determined the stability of domestic life. These cultural negotiations formed an additional layer within the broader exchange between American capital and British lineage, shaping how the alliances functioned beyond the legal settlement. As the first generation of transatlantic marriages matured into the early 20th century, questions of inheritance and succession moved to the forefront. The children born to American heiresses and British aristocrats embodied the consolidation of capital and title that their parents' alliances had engineered. Estate law in Britain operated under strict rules of primogeniture in many titled families, directing property and titles to the eldest male heir. At the same time, American dowries had often been structured through trusts to protect principal and ensure income for the bride and her descendants. The intersection of these legal systems required careful administration. In the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough, 2 sons were born during the marriage. The eldest, John Albert William Spencer Churchill, inherited the Marlborough title after his father's death. By that time, the financial reinforcement provided by the 1895 dowry had already reshaped estate stability. Blenheim Palace continued under improved conditions compared to the period preceding the marriage. Trust provisions ensured that portions of American capital remained within defined financial channels, rather than dissolving entirely into estate expenditure. Similarly, the marriage of Mary Victoria Leiter and George Curzon produced children who inherited both aristocratic designation and access to American-derived resources. Although Curzon later received elevation to the peerage as Marquess Curzon of Kettleston in the early 20th century, the financial underpinning established at marriage had strengthened the estate during critical years. Probate records and trust documentation demonstrate how American capital was preserved across generational lines. The children of these unions represented more than symbolic connections. They embodied legal integration of two financial traditions. The blending of assets altered inheritance planning within aristocratic households. Estate managers were required to coordinate British property law with American trust mechanisms. In some instances, separate income streams were maintained to ensure that capital originating in the United States retained defined legal identity. These arrangements prevented complete absorption of dowry funds into general estate debt. Archival financial ledgers confirmed that trust income continued to be dispersed to heirs long after the original marriage settlements. The presence of American ancestry within British titled lines gradually normalized the phenomenon. By the 1920s and 1930s, it was no longer unusual for a duke or earl to have a mother or grandmother born in the United States. The novelty that had characterized early marriages diminished. Integration became part of the lineage record rather than a social anomaly. These inheritance structures ensured that the consequences of transatlantic marriages extended beyond the lifespan of the original couples. Estates preserved through American dowries remained intact into subsequent generations. Titles passed to heirs whose maternal heritage reflected industrial America. The exchange between liquidity and lineage became embedded in genealogical continuity. By mid-20th century, the children and grandchildren of these alliances occupied positions within British society that would have been financially precarious without earlier capital infusion. The durability of trust agreements and estate restructuring confirmed that the marriages were designed with long-term perspective. The next generation inherited not only property and title, but also the institutional effects of calculated financial integration across national boundaries. As American-born duchesses and countesses settled into British aristocratic life, several assumed roles that extended beyond estate maintenance into organized philanthropy and public service. Their activities were documented in local records, charitable reports, aidas, and newspaper coverage. While the marriages that brought them to Britain were structured around financial exchange, the subsequent decades revealed engagement with social causes that reflected both British tradition and American influence. These activities did not alter the transactional origins of the unions, but they shaped public perception of the women involved. Consuelo Vanderbilt, after her separation and eventual annulment in 1921, became increasingly active in philanthropic initiatives. During her tenure as Duchess of Marlborough, she had supported local charities associated with Blenheim Palace and surrounding communities. Following the dissolution of her marriage, she expanded her engagement, particularly in France during the First World War, where she assisted with relief efforts. Records indicate involvement in medical and welfare organizations. Her later memoir acknowledged the constraints of her early marriage, yet contemporary documentation confirms that her charitable participation had been substantive rather than symbolic. Mary Victoria Curzon's public responsibilities were tied directly to imperial administration. As Viceroy of India beginning in 1899, Saufbawinas Fendian Baidin, she supported hospital initiatives, cultural preservation projects, and educational efforts within the framework of British governance. Official reports from the period reference her patronage of medical institutions and engagement with local artisans. These activities were integrated into the ceremonial obligations of her position. They required organizational skill and public visibility. Financial stability provided through her marriage enabled sustained participation. Philanthropy among American heiresses often reflected transatlantic influence. Exposure to organized charitable models in the United States informed their approach to institutional support. While British aristocratic tradition included patronage, American women sometimes emphasized structured fundraising and administrative oversight. Estate correspondence occasionally references the introduction of new management practices within charitable endeavors. These changes were incremental rather than transformative. Public reception of these efforts varied. In Britain, participation in local welfare reinforced legitimacy within regional communities. In the United States, reports of philanthropic engagement abroad tempered earlier criticism that such marriages were solely financial transactions. Nonetheless, charitable work did not redefine the structural character of the alliances. The primary foundation remained the exchange of capital for title. By the 1920s, as the wave of transatlantic marriages declined, the philanthropic records of American-born aristocrats contributed to a more complex historical assessment. They demonstrated that individual agency persisted within contractual frameworks. Estate preservation and title continuity remained central outcomes, but public service formed an additional dimension. The philanthropic involvement of women, such as Consuelo Vanderbilt and Mary Victoria Curzon, illustrates how transatlantic marriages produced layered consequences. Financial stabilization of estates coincided with engagement in community and imperial responsibilities. While the initial negotiations were grounded in economic necessity and social ambition, the subsequent decades revealed documented participation in institutional and charitable life. These contributions became part of the enduring legacy of American capital integrated into British hereditary society. By the early 20th century, historians and journalists alike had begun to recognize that the marriages of Consuelo Vanderbilt and Mary Victoria Leiter were not isolated cases, but part of a broader transatlantic pattern. Between the 1870s and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, more than 100 American heiresses married into European aristocratic families, with the majority entering the British peerage. Archival marriage registers, estate records, and newspaper accounts confirm the frequency of these alliances. The concentration was particularly strong during the 1880s and 1890s, when American industrial fortunes were at their height and British landed income was under sustained pressure. Families such as the Goulds, Jeromes, Whitneys, and Sloanes participated in comparable arrangements. Dowry amounts varied, but many exceeded several $100,000, and some reached into the millions. Estate correspondence often makes direct reference to debt reduction following receipt of American funds. In several documented cases, portions of ancestral art collections were retained rather than sold because dowry capital had stabilized finances. The cumulative effect across multiple households reshaped the economic landscape of segments of the British aristocracy. The term dollar princess entered common usage during this period, appearing in both American and British press. While sometimes employed with satirical tone, the label reflected widespread recognition that capital exchange was central to these unions. The marriages were discussed not only in society pages but also in financial commentary. Observers noted that American liquidity had become a factor in sustaining European hereditary institutions. The phenomenon illustrated broader patterns of global capital movement during the late 19th century. Statistical analysis of marriage patterns conducted by later historians demonstrates that the peak years for such alliances occurred before 1914. After the war, the number declined sharply. The reasons were structural. Wartime disruption reduced mobility. Tax reforms in both countries limited disposable wealth. Political changes diminished the influence of hereditary privilege. The earlier alignment between American liquidity and British estate need narrowed considerably. Nevertheless, the cumulative impact of those earlier decades remained measurable. Estates reinforced by American dowries entered the 20th century in stronger condition than many counterparts that lacked such support. Genealogical records reflect continued integration of American ancestry within British titled lines. The marriages influenced inheritance patterns, estate management, and in some cases political careers. The broader scale of the phenomenon confirms that the actions of mothers such as Alva Vanderbilt and Marietta Leiter were situated within a transnational economic context rather than purely personal ambition. Their decisions were facilitated by structural imbalance between industrial capital accumulation in the United States and declining land revenue in Britain. Legal contracts, estate accounts, and public reporting provide consistent documentation of this exchange. By examining the pattern collectively rather than individually, the historical significance becomes clearer. These marriages constituted a distinct chapter in the relationship between the United States and Britain. They connected private wealth with hereditary institutions at a moment when both societies were undergoing economic and political transformation. The alliances were numerous, structured, and sustained across several decades, leaving a measurable imprint on estates and family lineages that persists in archival record. By the mid-20th century, the era of large-scale transatlantic marriages between American heiresses and British aristocrats had largely concluded, yet the structural consequences of those alliances remained embedded in estate records and genealogical lines. Properties such as Blenheim Palace and Kettleston Hall continued to operate under financial frameworks influenced by dowry settlements negotiated decades earlier. Trust agreements established at the time of marriage persisted across generations, preserving portions of American capital within defined legal channels. These arrangements were not symbolic remnants. They continued to shape estate administration well into the 20th century. The long-term preservation of several historic country houses can be traced in part to these financial infusions. Estate maintenance during the interwar period required adaptive management in response to taxation and labor changes. Houses that had benefited from earlier debt reduction were better positioned to transition into new models of operation, including partial public access and heritage management. While not all estates survived intact, those reinforced during the late 19th century avoided immediate fragmentation. Financial intervention had extended their viability. Genealogically, American ancestry became normalized within segments of the British peerage. Descendants of Consuelo Vanderbilt and Mary Victoria Leiter inherited titles that combined hereditary designation with industrial capital heritage. By the mid-century, such lineage no longer generated the public fascination that had accompanied the initial marriages. The integration had become institutional rather than exceptional. Titles persisted. Estates remained associated with families whose wealth had originated in American railroads and retail enterprise. Historical interpretation of these marriages has evolved over time. Early commentary often emphasized social spectacle or personal dissatisfaction. Later scholarship has focused on structural economic analysis. Estate archives, legal contracts, and probate records provide evidence that the alliances functioned as calculated financial strategies. The exchange between liquidity and lineage responded to identifiable economic conditions. British landed income had declined. American industrial wealth had expanded. Marriage provided a mechanism for mutual reinforcement. The actions of mothers such as Alva Vanderbilt and Marietta Leiter illustrate how private family decisions intersected with global capital movement. Their negotiations were conducted within accepted legal frameworks and reflected prevailing social norms of the 19th century. While personal consequences varied, the economic objectives were clear. Estate stabilization and status consolidation were achieved through documented agreements. By the latter half of the 20th century, preservation of historic properties increasingly relied on heritage trusts and tourism, rather than dowry infusion. The earlier period of transatlantic marriage thus represents a distinct phase in the adaptation of aristocratic estates to modern economic pressures. It was neither purely romantic nor purely opportunistic. It was structured, negotiated, and recorded. The legacy endures in architecture, title succession, and archival documentation. American capital became part of British hereditary infrastructure during a defined historical window. The consequences remain visible in property accounts and family histories that trace the convergence of industrial wealth and inherited rank across national boundaries. Alva Vanderbilt, Marietta Leiter, and their contemporaries operated within the constraints and ambitions of the late 19th century. Their decisions were shaped by economic imbalance between American liquidity and British land-based wealth. Through negotiated marriages, they redirected industrial fortunes into aristocratic preservation. These alliances stabilized estates, influenced political trajectories, and redefined elite networks across two nations. Although the practice declined after the First World War, its architectural and genealogical consequences remain visible. The historical record presents their actions not as isolated scandals, but as calculated responses to structural conditions of their era.